Late one evening in the bustling heart of a nameless city, Clara emerged from her office building, the pale glow of streetlights casting long, uneven shadows across the sidewalk. It was a routine she knew well, staying late to finish reports, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked briskly toward the subway. But tonight, something felt wrong. She couldn't pinpoint it at first. The city's typical soundtrack, sirens in the distance, murmurs of passing strangers, and the hum of traffic, seemed amplified, sharper. The feeling struck when she crossed the street. It was subtle, the sense of being observed, the prickling of unseen eyes on her back. She glanced over her shoulder. Nothing. Just a man loitering near a newspaper stand, his face obscured by the brim of his baseball cap. Shrugging it off, Clara descended the subway steps, the world narrowing to the tiled corridors and the faint metallic scent of the underground. As the train rumbled into the station, she noticed him again. The man from the street. This time, he was closer, just a few feet away. She told herself it was coincidence. This was a city, after all. People shared routes. But when he boarded the same car and sat directly across from her, her unease grew roots. Clara pulled out her phone, pretending to scroll while she observed him from the corner of her eye. He wasn't looking at her, not exactly. His head was angled downward, but his presence was oppressive, as if his attention weighed on her like a physical force. She decided not to overreact. Maybe he was harmless. Maybe she was being paranoid. Her stop came. She stood, and so did he. Clara stepped off the train, her pulse quickening as his footsteps echoed behind her. She darted into the nearest convenience store, the fluorescent lights momentarily comforting. She lingered, pretending to browse, hoping he'd pass by. But he didn't. Instead, he stood outside the window, just barely visible in her periphery. The clerk noticed her hesitation. "You okay, miss?" he asked. She nodded, forcing a smile, but her heart was hammering. When she finally worked up the courage to leave, she clutched her keys tightly in her hand, her thumb resting on the emergency alarm button. The man was gone. Relief flooded her. The next morning, she laughed about it with her coworker Emily. "I was probably just imagining things," Clara said, stirring her coffee. Emily frowned. "Still, be careful. If it happens again, call someone. Better safe than sorry." That evening, Clara left work with more vigilance. Her eyes darted to every corner, her ears tuned to every sound. But the streets were calm, and she began to feel foolish. Yet, as she reached her apartment door, her blood turned cold. Propped against the door frame was a single white envelope. Her name was scrawled on the front in shaky, uneven handwriting. Inside was a photograph. It was of her, taken the night before, walking along the subway platform. The angle suggested it was shot from behind, perhaps from the same train car. Beneath the photo was a single sentence. "I like the way you look when you're scared." Clara slammed the door shut and called the police, her voice trembling. They arrived quickly, but there was little they could do. No fingerprints, no witnesses. "It could be a prank," the officer suggested. "Still, we'll keep an eye on your building." But it didn't stop. The notes kept coming, each more invasive than the last. Another photo, this time of her sitting at her desk at work, a shadowy figure visible through the glass doors. The police advised her to vary her routine, so she did. She took different routes, changed her work hours, and even stayed with Emily for a week. Still, he found her. One night, she awoke to the sound of tapping. Her heart sank as she realized it was coming from her bedroom window. She lived on the 5th floor. Slowly, she turned her head, her breath caught in her throat. There, just beyond the glass, was his face, pale, expressionless, and unblinking. She screamed, bolting from the room and locking herself in the bathroom. Her shaking hands fumbled with her phone as she dialed 911. The operator stayed on the line, calming her until the police arrived. When they did, they found no one. But outside her building, just below her window, they discovered a ladder and a single muddy footprint. The stalking escalated after that. He left gifts now. A lock of her hair he must have taken from her brush, a necklace she'd thought she'd lost. The notes became crueler, mocking her fear, describing her every move in chilling detail. Clara became a prisoner in her own life, jumping at shadows, unable to sleep, and then, one night, it stopped. Weeks passed with no sign of him. Clara began to piece her life back together, though the scars remained. She moved to a new apartment, changed her number, even cut her hair short, hoping to shed the version of herself he had fixated on. One evening, months later, Clara sat in her living room, the soft glow of her new lamp illuminating the pages of a book. For the first time in a long time, she felt at peace. That's when she heard it. A faint click. She froze, her eyes darting toward the source. The closet door just a few feet away was slightly ajar. Clara's breath hitched as a voice broke the silence, low and rasping, coming from the darkness within. "Did you miss me?" On the outskirts of a small town, nestled deep in a stretch of dense forest, there was an abandoned farmhouse that locals avoided at all costs. It was the sort of place whispered about at campfires and over hushed conversations, each tale more unnerving than the last. But no story ever truly captured the terror of what happened to Elise. Elise had recently moved to the area, lured by the promise of quiet solitude and cheap rent. She'd heard the rumors about the farmhouse from her new neighbors. A family had vanished there decades ago, they said, one night without a trace. The house stood still as if waiting, doors slightly ajar, the wind carrying faint whispers through its rotting walls. Elise wasn't one to buy into ghost stories. She was practical and, admittedly, a bit curious. So when she overheard a group of locals daring each other to visit the farmhouse, she decided she would go. Alone. The drive out was uneventful, the forest growing denser with every mile. The sun dipped low, casting fiery hues over the treetops. By the time Elise pulled up to the property, the sky had deepened into a heavy gray. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its silhouette jagged and misshapen against the fading light. She parked her car and stepped out, clutching a flashlight. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The porch creaked under her weight as she approached the front door. Pushing it open, she was met with a wave of cold air, unnatural for a summer evening. Inside, the house felt alive. The walls groaned faintly, and the floorboards beneath her feet seemed to sigh. Dust hung in the air, catching the beam of her flashlight. Broken furniture was strewn about, and the wallpaper was peeling, revealing dark stains beneath. But it was the silence that unnerved her most. It wasn't the absence of sound, but something deeper, a void, oppressive and suffocating. Elise ventured further, the light sweeping across a crumbling staircase and an old fireplace. Then she saw it, a single chair positioned in the center of the living room. On it sat a doll, its porcelain face cracked, one eye missing. It wasn't there when she'd first walked in. She was certain of it. Her pulse quickened. She told herself it was a prank, maybe left by other thrill-seekers. Swallowing her fear, she turned away, resolving to leave. But as she stepped toward the door, it slammed shut with a deafening bang. The sound reverberated through the house, and Elise spun around, the flashlight shaking in her grip. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, faintly, from somewhere upstairs, came the sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, and far too heavy to belong to an animal. Elise froze, her rational mind battling her instincts. She wasn't alone. The footsteps grew louder, descending the staircase. Her flashlight flickered, casting fleeting shadows that danced and twisted in unnatural shapes. She backed into the corner of the room, her breath coming in short gasps. The air grew colder, her skin prickling with every step that brought whatever was upstairs closer. "Who's there?" she demanded, trying to steady her voice. The footsteps stopped. A long, agonizing pause followed. Then, a voice, low and guttural, cut through the silence. "Why are you here?" Elise's heart pounded as she scanned the room. The beam of her flashlight caught movement. A figure at the base of the stairs, shrouded in darkness. Its limbs were wrong, too long and thin, as though it had been stretched. The figure took a step forward, and Elise bolted. She sprinted to the door, yanking at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. The windows were boarded up, and the air grew heavy, pressing against her chest like a weight. She could feel it closing in, the soft shuffling of its feet getting closer. Desperate, she turned back toward the room. The chair was empty now, the doll gone. Her flashlight flickered one last time before plunging her into darkness. A hand, cold, clammy, and impossibly strong, clamped down on her shoulder. She screamed, twisting and thrashing, but the grip only tightened. The voice whispered again, this time directly in her ear. "You should have stayed away." Elise awoke hours later, lying in her car with no memory of how she'd gotten there. The farmhouse stood in the distance, dark and silent as ever. She drove away without looking back, the events of that night seared into her mind. But the terror didn't end there. In the days that followed, she began to notice things. The sensation of being watched, fleeting shadows in her peripheral vision. And then, one night, as she lay in bed, her heart nearly stopped. On her bedside table sat the doll, its cracked face turned toward her, its single eye gleaming in the moonlight. The heavy rain drummed against the windows of Rachel's isolated cabin, tucked deep within the forest. She had retreated there for solitude to escape the noise of her life and finish the novel she'd been working on for years. The stormy weather was fitting, she thought. It added a sense of eerie charm. But by the end of that night, she would regret ever coming. It started with a knock at the door. Rachel paused her typing, her heart skipping a beat. She glanced at the clock. 11:13 p.m. Too late for visitors. The cabin was miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road. No one would be out here in weather like this. The knock came again. 3 sharp raps. Rachel got up, her feet hesitant against the creaking wooden floor. She peered through the peephole, but saw only darkness. The storm obscured everything beyond the dim porch light. "Hello?" she called, her voice barely audible over the rain. No answer. She debated ignoring it, but something gnawed at her, a curiosity that she couldn't shake. Slowly, she unlocked the door and cracked it open. The cold, wet air rushed in, sending a shiver down her spine. There was no one there. She leaned out slightly, her eyes scanning the empty porch and the woods beyond. "Is someone there?" she asked again, louder this time. Still nothing. Shaking her head, she shut the door, locking it firmly this time. Returning to her desk, she tried to push the incident from her mind, chalking it up to her imagination or perhaps a stray branch banging against the house. But then she heard it again. 3 sharp raps, louder this time. She jumped, the sound reverberating through the cabin. Heart racing, she grabbed her phone and dialed the local sheriff. The line crackled and her call failed. Of course, the storm had knocked out the signal. Her pulse quickened as the knocking continued, more insistent now. She grabbed a flashlight and cautiously approached the door. This time, she flung it open, shining the light onto the porch. Still nothing. The rain lashed against the ground, the wind howling through the trees. But as she turned to go back inside, her flashlight beam caught something. Just beyond the edge of the porch, where the rain met the shadow of the forest, stood a figure. It was tall and unnaturally still. Its face was obscured by the darkness, but its silhouette was unmistakable, thin, angular, and wrong, as though its proportions didn't quite belong. "Who are you?" Rachel shouted, her voice trembling. The figure didn't respond, didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Terrified, she slammed the door shut and bolted it, dragging a heavy bookshelf in front for good measure. She backed away, clutching her phone, desperate for a signal. None came. The knocking resumed, louder and more forceful. But this time, it wasn't at the door. It was coming from the windows, first one, then another, as though the figure was circling the house. Rachel's breath came in short gasps as she darted to each window, closing the curtains. The sound stopped. Silence fell, broken only by the rain. Rachel stood frozen in the center of the room, every muscle in her body tense. Minutes passed, stretching into an eternity. She began to think, hope, that it was over. And then came the sound of footsteps. They were slow, deliberate, and inside the cabin. Rachel turned, her flashlight trembling in her grip. The beam landed on the hallway leading to her bedroom. The door was slightly ajar, and she was certain she had closed it earlier. The footsteps grew louder, closer. "Leave me alone," she screamed, backing into the kitchen. She grabbed the largest knife she could find, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it. The footsteps stopped just outside the kitchen. Rachel held her breath, the silence pressing against her like a weight. Then, in the darkness of the hallway, she saw it. A pale face peeking out from behind the doorframe, its eyes wide and unblinking. It smiled. Rachel ran, knife forgotten, as she bolted for the front door. She yanked the bookshelf aside, her fingers fumbling with the lock. Behind her, the footsteps broke into a sprint. She didn't dare look back. The door flew open, and she stumbled onto the porch, rain soaking her instantly. She didn't stop running, her bare feet slipping on the muddy ground as she plunged into the woods. The trees closed in around her, the storm swallowing every sound except her ragged breathing. Finally, she collapsed against a tree, her body trembling from exhaustion and fear. She dared a glance behind her, but the figure was nowhere to be seen. Relief washed over her, though it was fleeting. As she caught her breath, a whisper cut through the storm, low and taunting, coming from the darkness all around her. "You can't run." And then, from the shadows, she saw dozens of faces emerge, smiling, unblinking, and impossibly pale. The night was cold and quiet when Marcus pulled into the old rest stop off Highway 13. He was hours into a long drive, the kind that makes you feel like the road is swallowing you whole. His eyes were heavy, and the ache in his shoulders demanded a break. The rest stop looked deserted. Just a couple of rusted picnic tables and a vending machine buzzing faintly under a flickering light. He parked near the vending machine, grateful for the slight glow in the otherwise pitch-black night. The forest surrounding the rest stop was dense, the kind where the trees seemed to lean in close, suffocating any hint of moonlight. He stepped out, stretched, and breathed in the crisp air. A sign near the vending machine caught his eye. "Do not enter the woods after dark." The bold red letters were faded, peeling, as though no one had bothered to replace the sign in years. He snorted at the ominous tone, chalking it up to local folklore meant to scare kids or campers. But then he noticed something strange. Scratch marks gouged deep into the metal of the vending machine. 4 parallel lines, long and jagged as if made by claws. The unease crept in, but he shook it off. Probably vandals, he thought. He fed a few crumpled bills into the machine and waited as the gears groaned to life. As he reached for the candy bar, he caught movement in his peripheral vision. Someone, or something, was standing at the edge of the forest. He froze, his hand still in the vending machine. The figure was barely visible, just a silhouette against the impenetrable black of the woods. It didn't move. It didn't even seem to breathe. Marcus squinted, trying to make out details, but the dim light offered nothing. "Hey!" he called out, his voice stronger than he felt. No response. His instinct told him to leave, but pride kept him rooted. "If you're trying to scare me, it's not going to work," he added, his voice faltering slightly. The figure stepped closer. It moved unnaturally, almost gliding, its shape becoming clearer. It was tall, too tall and thin, its limbs unnervingly long. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he realized it wasn't walking but shifting, its movements jerky and wrong, as if it were a puppet on strings. Marcus stumbled back to his car, fumbling for his keys. His hands trembled as he unlocked the door, yanking it open and diving inside. He locked the doors and gripped the steering wheel, his heart pounding. The figure was closer now, standing just beyond the flickering light. For the first time, he saw its face, or lack of one. Where a face should have been was a blank, featureless expanse, pale and smooth like stretched leather. Its head tilted slightly as though studying him, and then it smiled, not with a mouth, but with the very fabric of its face, splitting open to reveal rows of jagged, needle-like teeth. The smile stretched impossibly wide, far beyond where its cheeks should have been. Marcus screamed and slammed the car into reverse. The tires screeched as he spun around, the headlights catching the figure one last time. It didn't move to chase him. It didn't need to. As he sped down the highway, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, he glanced in the rearview mirror. The rest stop was a shrinking dot in the distance. But in the mirror, just behind his car, he saw it again. The figure was keeping pace, gliding silently along the road, its impossible smile growing wider and wider. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it was gone. Marcus didn't stop driving until he reached a gas station miles away. When he finally pulled over, shaking and drenched in sweat, he told the attendant about what he'd seen. The old man behind the counter looked at him, his face grave. "You stopped at the rest stop on Highway 13, didn't you?" he asked, his voice low. Marcus nodded. The man sighed, shaking his head. "You're lucky you got away. They don't usually let people leave." "They?" Marcus whispered. The man didn't answer. He just handed Marcus a cup of coffee and muttered, "Don't look in the mirror tonight." Marcus drove on, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But as the night wore on, he couldn't resist glancing into the mirror, and when he did, it was there, smiling back at him from the back seat. Sarah had always loved thrift stores. There was something thrilling about sifting through the old, the forgotten, and the discarded. She never knew what she might find: vintage dresses, antique trinkets, or a rare book. But the day she stumbled across the mirror, she would learn that some things should stay forgotten. It was an ornate, full-length mirror with a thick, gilded frame. The carvings along the edges were intricate, twisting vines, strange faces, and symbols she didn't recognize. The glass was slightly tarnished, giving it an otherworldly sheen. It sat in the corner of the store, leaning against the wall as though it had been left there by mistake. When Sarah asked the shopkeeper about it, the woman hesitated. "That thing's been here forever," she said. "No one wants it. You can have it for $20 if you're sure you want it." Sarah didn't think twice. She paid for the mirror, loaded it into her car, and brought it home, pleased with her unusual find. She placed it in her bedroom, opposite her bed, where it could catch the light from the window. That night, as she lay in bed scrolling through her phone, she noticed something odd. In the dim glow of her bedside lamp, the reflection in the mirror didn't quite match the room. It wasn't obvious at first, just a subtle shift. The shadows seemed deeper, the corners of the room darker. Sarah chalked it up to the mirror's tarnished glass and went to sleep. The next night, it got worse. As Sarah lay in bed, her phone screen illuminating her face, she felt it, that creeping sensation of being watched. She glanced at the mirror and her breath caught. Her reflection wasn't moving. She stared at it, trying to rationalize what she was seeing. Maybe it was the way the light hit the glass, an optical illusion. She lifted her hand and waved. The reflection hesitated, then waved back, but not quite in sync. It was slower, deliberate, almost mocking. Sarah sat up, her heart pounding. The reflection sat up too, but its movements were jerky, unnatural, like a puppet being pulled by strings. She turned away from the mirror, grabbing her phone to call a friend. When she looked back, her reflection was standing, pressed against the glass, its hands splayed as if trying to push through. She screamed and threw a blanket over the mirror, unable to look at it any longer. That night, sleep didn't come easily. She kept hearing faint scratching sounds like nails dragging against glass. But every time she turned on the light, the room was still. By morning, she convinced herself it was all in her head. She decided to get rid of the mirror. She hauled it into her car and drove to the dump, leaving it propped against a pile of broken furniture. Feeling lighter, she went home, relieved to be rid of it. But when she walked into her bedroom, her blood ran cold. The mirror was back, leaning against the wall where it had been. The blanket she'd thrown over it crumpled on the floor. Panicked, she called the shopkeeper. "I need to know where you got this mirror," she demanded. There was a long silence before the woman finally spoke. "It came from an estate sale," she said. "The family, something happened to them. They said the mirror was cursed, but I didn't believe it." "What happened to them?" Sarah whispered. "They disappeared," the shopkeeper replied. "All of them. The house was locked from the inside. No sign of a struggle, no bodies, just gone." Sarah hung up, her hands trembling. She decided to destroy the mirror. Grabbing a hammer, she swung it at the glass with all her strength. The glass didn't crack. Instead, the hammer seemed to sink into the surface as though it had struck water. She dropped it, stumbling back in horror. The reflection smiled. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She sat in the corner of her room, keeping her eyes on the mirror, afraid to look away. Sometime around 3 a.m., she dozed off. When she woke up, she wasn't in her room anymore. The air was cold and heavy, the light dim and gray. She was standing in a room that looked like hers, but wasn't. The edges of the space blurred, and everything had a faint, distorted sheen, like she was underwater. She turned to where the mirror should have been, but now it was a window looking into her bedroom. And on the other side of the glass was her reflection, sitting on her bed, smiling at her. It raised a hand in a mock wave before turning off the light. The last thing Sarah saw before the darkness swallowed her was her own face, twisted in a grin that wasn't her own. Late one night, Eric was driving home from a business trip. The road was quiet, winding through endless miles of farmland. His headlights sliced through the darkness, revealing nothing but the empty road and fields of swaying corn. The GPS indicated another 40 miles to his small town. As he drove, a sign loomed out of the darkness. "Caution. Hitchhikers may be escaped inmates." Eric chuckled nervously. It was the kind of sign you'd expect to see in a horror movie. He turned the radio on to distract himself, but the signal was weak, and all he got was static. The hum of his tires on the pavement was the only sound keeping him company. He didn't see her at first. The figure appeared suddenly on the side of the road, illuminated by his high beams. A young woman, drenched from head to toe, wearing what looked like a hospital gown. She stood perfectly still, one arm raised in a limp attempt to signal for help. Eric slammed on the brakes, his heart pounding. He came to a stop a few yards ahead of her. Against every instinct screaming at him to keep driving, he put the car in reverse and rolled down the passenger window. "Are you okay?" he asked, leaning over. The woman didn't respond. Her head was bowed, her long, wet hair clinging to her face. She stood there, unmoving, the light from his car casting eerie shadows on her gaunt frame. Eric hesitated. Something about her felt off, but he couldn't just leave her there. "Do you need a ride?" he asked again. This time, she nodded slowly and walked toward the car. The door creaked open as she slid into the passenger seat without a word. Her movements were sluggish, almost mechanical. Eric noticed her bare feet were muddy, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "You're soaked," he said, trying to mask his unease. "What happened?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned her head slowly to face him. Her eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto his, and for a moment Eric swore they didn't look human. Something primal, something wrong lurked in that gaze. He cleared his throat and put the car in drive. "I'll take you to the nearest gas station," he said. "You can call for help there." As the car picked up speed, the woman remained silent, her eyes fixed on him. The air inside the car grew colder, the windows fogging slightly despite the heater being on. Eric tried to focus on the road, but her presence gnawed at his nerves. "You from around here?" he asked, desperate to break the tension. "No," she whispered. Her voice was raspy, barely audible, like it hadn't been used in years. The road stretched on, the cornfields seeming to close in around them. Eric glanced at her again, and his stomach dropped. Her head had tilted at an impossible angle, her neck bent as though it were broken. Her lips curled into a smile too wide, too unnatural. "Are you okay?" he stammered, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. She didn't answer. Instead, she raised her hand and pointed ahead. "Turn here," she rasped. Eric hadn't noticed the side road until she mentioned it, a narrow dirt path leading into the cornfields. I don't think that's the way to the gas station," he said, his voice shaking. "Turn," she said again, her voice sharper this time, almost commanding. Eric's instincts screamed at him to keep going, to stay on the main road. But his hands seemed to move on their own, twisting the wheel and guiding the car onto the dirt path. The fields closed in around him as the path grew narrower, the cornstalks brushing against the sides of the car. The headlights illuminated nothing but more corn. "I don't think this is right," he said, his voice trembling. "Maybe we should." The car suddenly stalled, the engine sputtering to silence. The headlights flickered and went out, plunging them into complete darkness. Eric fumbled with the keys, trying to restart the car. The woman began to hum softly, a haunting, disjointed tune that sent chills down his spine. What are you doing?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She stopped humming and turned to face him fully. Her face had changed. Her skin was pale and stretched tight over her skull, her eyes black and sunken. Her mouth twisted into that same grotesque smile, revealing sharp, jagged teeth. "You shouldn't have stopped," she hissed. Eric screamed, throwing open the door and stumbling into the cornfield. The stalks towered over him, their rustling blending with the sound of his panicked breaths. He ran blindly, the dirt path forgotten, the woman's laughter echoing behind him. When he finally emerged from the cornfield, he found himself back on the highway. His car was gone. The road was empty, silent, as if none of it had ever happened. A trucker picked him up hours later, shaken and disoriented. Eric tried to explain what had happened, but the trucker just shook his head. "You're lucky," the man said. "Folks around here know better than to stop on that stretch of road." "You didn't see the girl, did you?" Eric froze, his blood turning to ice. "They say she's been out there for years," the trucker continued. "Lures people off the road, and they're never seen again. Count yourself lucky, son, you got away." Eric didn't feel lucky, because as the truck sped down the highway, he glanced at the side mirror, and in the reflection, he saw her sitting in the back seat, smiling. The tiny town of Hollow Creek was known for its eerie stories, but the tale of the Watcher in the Woods was one that everyone whispered about and no one dared to challenge. Everyone in town knew not to venture too close to the old forest once the sun dipped below the horizon. Everyone, that is, except Alex. Alex was a newcomer, a skeptic who had just moved to a crumbling farmhouse on the edge of town. The locals warned him about the forest, their voices low, their eyes darting nervously to the tree line. They spoke of shadows that moved without light, of footsteps that followed when no one was there. "Stay out of the woods at night," the old grocer had said, his face pale. "It doesn't like visitors." Alex laughed it off. He wasn't one for ghost stories. So when his dog, Max, bolted into the woods one evening, Alex grabbed a flashlight and followed, ignoring the growing unease that twisted in his stomach. The forest was dense, the trees towering like ancient sentinels. The deeper he went, the quieter it became. No wind, no rustling leaves, not even the chirp of crickets, just silence so thick it felt alive. "Max!" Alex called, his voice echoing unnaturally. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, illuminating nothing but gnarled roots and thick underbrush. Then he heard it, a soft rhythmic sound like someone lightly tapping on wood. "Tap! Tap! Tap!" "Max!" he called again, his voice wavering. The tapping continued, growing louder, closer. He swept the flashlight beam around, searching for the source. At first, he saw nothing. Then, just ahead, he noticed a tree unlike the others. Its bark was smooth and pale, almost like flesh, and etched into its surface was a single word: leave. Alex's breath hitched. He stumbled back, the flashlight shaking in his hand. That's when he saw the figure. It stood between the trees, barely visible in the shadows. Tall and thin, its limbs too long, its head cocked unnaturally to one side. Its eyes glinted in the faint light, large and reflective, like a predator watching its prey. "Who's there?" Alex demanded, trying to keep his voice steady. The figure didn't respond. It didn't move. But the tapping sound continued, echoing around him. And then it stepped closer. Alex's instinct screamed at him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. The figure moved with an unnatural fluidity, its head twitching as it closed the distance. In the dim light, he could make out its face, or rather, the lack of one. It was smooth and featureless, a blank canvas that seemed to ripple like water. The tapping grew deafening, pounding in his ears. He realized with horror that it wasn't coming from the figure. It was coming from the trees. All around him, the pale trees began to shift, their surfaces twisting and bulging as if something inside was trying to break free. Alex bolted, his flashlight bouncing wildly as he sprinted through the underbrush. The tapping followed him, relentless, joined by the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the forest behind him. He didn't dare look back. When he finally burst out of the woods, gasping for air, he collapsed on the grass near his farmhouse. The tapping stopped. The forest was silent once more. Max was waiting for him on the porch, wagging his tail as if nothing had happened. Alex pulled him close, trembling. He glanced back at the tree line, half expecting to see the figure lurking there. But the woods were still. The next morning, Alex decided to leave Hollow Creek. He packed his things quickly, wanting nothing more than to put distance between himself and the forest. As he loaded the last box into his truck, he noticed something strange on the side of his farmhouse. Etched into the wood in deep, jagged letters was a single word: stay. He didn't look back as he drove away, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And that night, miles away from Hollow Creek, as he stopped at a motel to rest, he heard it again. Tap, tap, tap. It was past midnight when Lisa's phone buzzed, jolting her from her light sleep. Groggy, she reached for it, expecting a spam notification or an accidental message. But when she saw the screen, her stomach dropped. 1. New message from unknown number. The message read, "I'm watching you." Lisa sat up, her heart racing. It had to be a prank. She lived alone in her small apartment, and the idea of someone watching her at this hour sent a shiver down her spine. She locked her phone and tossed it onto the nightstand, telling herself it was probably a wrong number or a cruel joke. But then it buzzed again. Nice pajamas. Her blood turned cold. Slowly, she turned her head to look at herself. She was wearing her favorite striped pajamas, one she hadn't posted about or mentioned to anyone. Her curtains were drawn, but the thought of someone outside made her skin crawl. With shaking hands, she texted back, "Who is this? What do you want?" The reply came almost instantly. "Don't worry, you'll find out soon." Her breath hitched. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911, but the line crackled and went dead before it even rang. The signal was gone. The phone buzzed again. "Don't call for help, I'm already inside." Lisa froze. Her eyes darted around the room. It was silent, except for the faint hum of the fridge in the kitchen. Slowly, she slid out of bed, her bare feet brushing the cold floor. She grabbed the metal bat she kept under the bed for emergencies. With the bat gripped tightly, she moved toward the bedroom door. She peeked into the dark hallway, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The apartment looked normal, untouched. She crept toward the front door to check the locks, still bolted. Her phone buzzed again, the sound cutting through the tense silence. She hesitated but glanced at the screen. Behind you. Lisa spun around, swinging the bat wildly. The hallway was empty. Her chest heaved as she backed into the living room, her hands trembling. Her phone buzzed once more. You missed me. The message was followed by a photo. Lisa stared at the screen in horror. It was a picture of her, taken from behind, holding the bat. She whirled around again, desperate to see who was there, but the room was empty. A faint creak echoed from the kitchen. She clutched the bat tighter and moved toward the sound. The light above the sink flickered as she approached. She could hear her heartbeat pounding in her ears. The cabinet door beneath the sink was slightly ajar. She raised the bat, her muscles tense. With one swift motion, she yanked the door open and swung the bat down. It collided with nothing but air. The cabinet was empty. Her phone buzzed again. Warmer. Tears pricked her eyes as she backed away, the weight of the bat feeling useless in her hands. She glanced at the phone, her mind racing. She needed to get out, but where would she go? Then came the final message. Found you. The light in the kitchen went out. Lisa screamed, swinging the bat in every direction, but the darkness swallowed her cries. The last thing she heard was the sound of her phone hitting the floor, and then silence. When the neighbors found her apartment the next day, the door was still locked, the windows sealed. The only sign of Lisa was her phone lying on the kitchen floor, its screen displaying a single photo, an empty apartment. Jamie loved to jog at night. The streets were quieter, the air cooler, and the city felt like it belonged solely to her. Her favorite route took her through the neighborhood park, a sprawling area of winding paths, tall trees, and the occasional bench lit by dim, flickering streetlights. One particular evening, she left her apartment around 10 p.m., her headphones playing her usual playlist. The streets were unusually empty, but she didn't mind. It added to the serenity of her nightly routine. As she approached the park, she noticed something odd. A faint, rhythmic tapping echoed in the distance, just barely audible over her music. She pulled out one earbud and slowed her pace, listening carefully. The tapping grew louder, sharper, like someone knocking on wood. It seemed to come from deeper within the park. Probably just a woodpecker, she thought, resuming her jog. She followed her usual path, her sneakers crunching softly against the gravel trail. The tapping faded as she moved deeper into the park, replaced by the rustling of leaves and the occasional distant car. But then, as she rounded a bend, she saw it. A lone figure standing under one of the dim streetlights ahead. The figure was unnaturally still, their head tilted slightly to one side. They wore a long coat that fluttered slightly in the breeze, though the rest of their body remained motionless. Jamie hesitated. Something about the figure made her uneasy, but she brushed it off as paranoia. This was a public park, after all. People stood around sometimes, didn't they? She jogged closer, her steps slower and more cautious. The figure didn't move. As she passed under the streetlight just ahead of them, she glanced over. The figure had no face. Jamie stumbled, her heart pounding as she quickly looked away. It was a mask, she told herself, some weird blank mask. Maybe a prank. She forced herself to keep jogging, determined not to show fear. But the tapping started again. It was louder now, sharper, and it was coming from behind her. She glanced over her shoulder and her stomach dropped. The faceless figure was walking toward her, their movements unnaturally jerky, their long arms swinging with each uneven step. Jamie broke into a sprint, her breathing ragged. The tapping didn't stop. It followed her, matching her pace, echoing through the trees. She veered off the main path, plunging into the darker, unlit areas of the park. Her legs burned as she pushed herself faster, weaving between trees and bushes. The tapping grew louder, closer, relentless. She didn't dare look back in eternity. After what felt like an eternity, she burst out onto the other side of the park. The houses were dark, the windows closed, but the sight of them brought her a small sense of relief. She slowed to a jog, glancing over her shoulder one last time. The figure was gone. Shaking, she jogged home as fast as her legs would carry her. She locked the door behind her, double-checked all the windows, and collapsed onto her couch, her chest heaving. The tapping had stopped. Just as she started to calm down, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. It was a text from an unknown number. "Why did you run?" Jamie's breath caught. Her hands trembled as she stared at the screen. Another message followed. "I found you." A soft, rhythmic tapping came from the window behind her. It was a crisp autumn evening when Laura moved into the old Victorian house at the edge of town. She had inherited it from a distant relative she had never met, and though the place was worn and a little eerie, she saw it as a fresh start. The townsfolk, however, were less enthusiastic. "You're staying there?" the cashier at the general store asked, her eyes widening. "People don't usually last long in that house?" Laura laughed nervously. "Why's that?" The cashier just shook her head. "Strange things happen there. Just be careful." Brushing off the warnings as small-town superstition, Laura spent the day unpacking and getting settled. By nightfall, she was exhausted and ready to sleep. The house creaked and groaned as the wind blew outside, but she told herself it was just the age of the place. She climbed into bed and quickly drifted off. At exactly 3:03 a.m., she woke up to the sound of faint knocking. Knock! 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 It was steady and deliberate, coming from downstairs. Groggy and annoyed, Laura grabbed her phone and checked the time. Who would be knocking at this hour? She considered ignoring it, but the knocking persisted. Wrapping herself in a robe, she crept down the creaky staircase. The sound grew louder as she reached the front door. Knock! 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 She peeked through the peephole. No one was there. Heart pounding, she opened the door a crack, the hinges groaning loudly. The porch was empty, the streets silent and bathed in moonlight. She stepped outside, shivering in the chilly air, and looked around. Still, no one. "Hello?" she called out, but only the wind answered. Closing and locking the door, she returned to bed, her nerves rattled. She told herself it was probably kids playing a prank. But deep down, something about the knocking felt wrong. The next night, it happened again. At 3:03 a.m., Laura woke to the same sound. Knock! 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 This time, it wasn't coming from the front door. It was coming from the basement. She sat up, her heart racing. She had barely even been in the basement. It was cold, damp, and smelled of mildew. The idea of someone being down there sent a chill down her spine. Gripping her phone tightly, she slowly made her way downstairs. The basement door stood ajar. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. No response. She flicked on the light, illuminating the rickety wooden stairs leading down into the dark. The knocking had stopped. She hesitated, then slowly descended, the old stairs creaking under her weight. The basement was as she remembered it, cold and empty, with cobwebs clinging to the corners. But then she saw it. A small wooden door on the far wall she hadn't noticed before. It was slightly open. Laura stared at it, her stomach churning. She took a hesitant step forward, then another. When she reached the door, she pushed it open with trembling fingers. Inside was a small, dark room. The air was thick and heavy, and the walls were covered in scratches. Deep, deliberate gouges, as though someone or something had been clawing to get out. Then she saw the words etched into the wood in jagged, uneven letters. "Let me in." A cold breeze blew past her, extinguishing the single bare bulb overhead. Laura screamed, stumbling backward out of the room. She fumbled her way up the stairs, slamming the basement door shut behind her. The knocking resumed. Knock, knock, knock. But this time, it was coming from inside the basement door. Laura grabbed her phone and called the police, her hands shaking. When they arrived, she frantically explained what had happened. They searched the house thoroughly, including the basement, but found nothing unusual. "There's no small door down here," one of the officers said, giving her a concerned look. Laura's blood ran cold. She descended into the basement again, determined to prove she wasn't imagining things. But the small wooden door was gone. Nothing remained but a solid concrete wall. That night, Laura bolted the basement door and pushed a heavy dresser in front of it. She tried to convince herself it was over, but as the clock struck 3:03 a.m., the knocking returned. This time, it came from her bedroom closet.